The next theory we're going to look at is psychological theory, and we're going to look at that much more briefly because we're really going to build on our understanding of biological understandings. Just as we have rejected simplistic biological notions as something about somebody's biology is going to cause crime, so we nowadays realize that somebody's psychology will not in itself determine their criminality. However, we don't just reject psychology as having any explanation for why crime occurs. On the contrary, we are once again going back to psychology, but with far greater subtlety, to have a look at the ways, for example, certain kinds of mental illness may increase the likelihood that certain kinds of crime can occur. Here, though, we are talking once again about correlation, not causation. I would also remind you, and we'll come back to this when we talk about prisons, that in many ways, people who suffer from certain kinds of mental illness are much more likely to be victims of crime because of those mental illnesses than perpetrators of crime. That doesn't mean that we do not still have a small but significant reality where some kinds of mental illness might predispose people to a greater likelihood or possibility, not certainty, of committing crime. As you might guess, sociologists love sociological theories within criminology best. That wasn't a difficult one to work out. And the reason they do is because sociologists see social structures and social conditions as being tremendously important in shaping how we act as individuals and as groups, as small groups, as big groups, as societies, as nations, and so on. Sociologists argue that social groups shape people's behavior in all sorts of ways. That's why the same person might behave differently whether they're in the classroom or a fraternity or a sporting team or at their job. Taking that to the level of criminology, there's a big emphasis on the idea that criminals are made, not born. No baby is born a criminal. People are shaped into becoming criminals by all sorts of factors. The fact that external factors shape criminality does not necessarily mean that individual factors don't matter. Those might be the individual factors of choice. People can choose to commit crime, or individual factors at a level people don't choose, like certain kinds of mental illness or certain kinds of or hormonal imbalances. Sociologists also tend to emphasize particular kinds of structures and particular kinds of influences as being very important in understanding the dynamics of crime. Causation of crime, victimization in crime, and so on. So, things like relative income, things like race as a social construct and what race means in society, things like age, things like the built environment, are all understood by different sociological theorists within criminology to be helpful in understanding why crime occurs. We are going to look briefly at three categories of sociological theories of crime: social structure theories, social process theories, and social conflict theories. Let's start off with the social structure theories. Social structure theories really focus on economics insofar as they look at the fact, or they argue that poorer people or the lower class, are much more likely to commit crime. Poverty itself is seen as criminogenic. Remember, that's the term we borrowed from Lombroso, as are things that are more likely to come with poverty, like broken families or bad housing. Perhaps one of the most important social structure theorists within criminology is a sociologist named Robert Merton. I'm going to point you to a video that is going to allow you to look at one of his arguments in quite a lot of detail, his argument about strain theory. And given that that video explains it so well, we won't go into it here. In addition to his arguments about strain theory, Merton came up with his idea about anomie from really observing what happens to communities where there is relatively sudden urbanization and people from all different communities are brought together. What Merton said is when people live in very homogeneous communities where they've lived there for a very long time, there tends to be a standard set of rules, both written and unwritten, according to which people abide. And they are kept in those, people are kept to those rules by socialization, how they're brought up, by their neighbors, by their community, in a sense of it takes a village to raise a child, where everybody's on the same page and your neighbor next door will say something if you as a kid misbehave, or your friend's mom will say something if you misbehave. And so values, including values preventing crime, are kept together by the community. However, when you have urbanization, especially when it's rapid and it's with diverse groups, lots of different immigrant groups, or even groups from many parts of the same country urbanizing to the cities, that kind of social change leads to something Merton calls anomie, where you no longer feel connected to community. You no longer feel connected to the same rules, to the same values, to the same kind of structures that can keep you in line. And so Merton sees that sort of social change, especially related with sudden urbanization and tremendous diversity, as leading to anomie and dislocation, because you no longer feel compelled to obey the criminal laws that are around you, because you no longer feel yourself bound by them in the sense of connectivity to other people. In contrast to the social structure theories which focus on the lower classes or the poorer classes, social process theories don't look at class or education in themselves. Rather, social process theories argue that all people have an equal potential to become a criminal. So that raises the question, if everyone has equal potential to become a criminal, why are some people more likely to become a criminal than others? And the short answer to lots of different social process theories is because of different circumstances in their lives. So we are going to divide up social process theories into different groups. The first are learning theories of crime. And any kid who's ever had a parent say to them, I really don't like you hanging out with that person, they're not a good kid, they don't come from a good family, has actually already learned about or been introduced to learning theories of crime. These are also called differential association theories of crime. This is the idea that criminal activity is learned behavior, and who we associate with can make the difference as to whether or not we are likely to become criminal or not become criminal. So that's the idea that our associations make the difference in the likelihood that we will be criminal or non-criminal in our behaviors. The second kind of theory we're going to look at over here are control theories. And this social process theory emphasizes that people learn from or get cued from the influences in their communities through their social linkages. So different communities have different norms that can shape people's behaviors. That is why people will often behave differently, whether they're at school or at home, in a religious institution, in the workplace, or on the streets. Because in different environments, we may or may not have different social controls operating against each other. That's why so often the most hardened thugs are above all embarrassed about what their mothers will think about their criminality. Because, say, within the gang culture, it's cool to be a thug. But to mom, or to mom in her church community, that is not okay. That is the idea of control theories. Our final social process theory is the idea of labeling theories. And this is the idea that we behave in certain ways, not just because of what comes from within. In fact, not very much from what comes from within, but rather from how we are labeled and defined from the outside. So if we are labeled as a good person, we are much more likely to behave as a good person. If we are labeled as a bad person, we are much more likely to behave as a bad person. And this becomes very important in terms of thinking about the consequences of using criminal sanctioning, using criminal punishment as a way to stop crime. Because what labeling theory argues is if you have somebody who is labeled a who is labeled a criminal, they are much more likely to identify with a criminal subculture and a criminal community and a criminal identity than if somebody is labeled a law-abiding person. So what labeling theory suggests is social control agencies like courts and prisons should be looking to bring people back into mainstream norms rather than pushing them out of mainstream norms and towards deviant and criminal identities. By the way, a heads up, this links to ideas of conflict theory and the role of society to label something as criminal and non-criminal and what sort of influence that has. But that's jumping ahead of ourselves. Social conflict theory is a really interesting sociological theory trying to explain crime because in many ways it reverses the question about crime. Instead of asking the question, why do people commit crime? It asks, who defines crime? And what is the purpose of that definition of crime? In many ways, social conflict theories are influenced by Marx's theories about capitalism and the inequalities that capitalism produces. What Marx said is that those in power, people who control the ownership of wealth in our society and the sources of wealth in society, make rules, make laws in ways that give themselves benefits. And they write laws and make practices of the criminal justice system in ways that protect the wealth of the elites, protect the privilege of the elites, and define those who fall into the have-nots as, in their behaviors, as much more likely to be criminal. So the key issue for social conflict theorists is to say, how do we define crime? And how does that benefit or burden different groups in society? And it looks at those groups in terms of what they have to gain or lose in that definition of crime. Most of the work of social conflict theories was not actually done by Marx himself, but by many subsequent criminologists who went out and had a look not just at how crime is defined, but how crime is policed and how crime is punished. So in looking at policing crime, they would look at, for example, is there equal kind of policing in rich and poor neighborhoods? And the answer is no. No wonder you find more crime in poor communities if you've got more police officers there, they would argue. No wonder if you catch more black people transporting drugs in their cars, if you pull over more black drivers. It's the law of statistics over here. Likewise, they've looked at punishment of crime and they've noticed that poorer people, black people, immigrants, especially marginalized immigrants, people with mental illness, another category of marginalized people, are much more likely to be punished for committing crime than are the elites. The core ideas of conflict theory are in many ways captured in a book title called The Rich Get Richer, the Poor Get Prison, which looks at the many different ways in which the criminal justice serves to maintain or further inequality in our society, whether based on class or race. In some ways, one might consider this the cynic's golden rule. This is not the golden rule you were taught in kindergarten, which said, do unto others as you will have them do unto you. This is the cynic's golden rule. The cynic's golden rule lines up with conflict theory insofar as it says, whoever has the gold rules. Finally, let's close our discussion of criminological theories by looking at some other theories which do pull from sociology but also pull in from other disciplines as well. The first draws on developmental psychology, and it's the life course theory of crime, and that recognizes that whether certain events do or don't happen in a person's life and at what point they happen really increases or decreases the chance that someone will get involved in crime. So, for example, getting married significantly decreases our chances of committing crime. Having children significantly decreases our chances of having crime. This is the insight of the life course theory. In response to the feminist movement of the 1960s and 1970s, feminist criminologists came in and looked at all the different ways gender shapes crime, whether it's ideas of being a tough man, leading men being more likely, say, to engage in a bar fight to defend their honor and dignity than women, or having a look at how differently men and women are processed through the criminal justice system, or having a look at how ideas of gender shape our understandings of what is or is not crime. When a young girl runs away, at least historically, she's been more likely to think of as engaging in promiscuous behavior or being a prostitute, in contrast to a young boy running away. Those are ideas of gender. And finally, something that's very important to contemporary policymakers, we recognize that the physical environment can and does make a difference in terms of increasing or decreasing the likelihood that people are going to commit crime. So one of the big mistakes of public housing projects that were built for many decades, especially after World War II, is they tend to be built very, very tall. And that led to the sort of anomie Merton talked about that promoted crime and criminogenic environments. In contrast, different kinds of physical environments, things like having lighting, things like having parks in the right places, could make a big difference at decreasing crime. So together with all these very practical things, as well as these big theoretical ideas, we can see that there are lots of practical implications about what we can do to decrease crime by paying attention to these criminological theories. And remember, it's an and, not an or.